She is the kind of person who quietly rearranges landscapes and headlines at the same time. An heiress who prefers forests and peatlands to cocktail parties, who uses family capital to protect rainforests and revive highland glens, and who nevertheless sits on a fortune born from one of the world's most playful inventions. This is a long-form read-over script about the life, choices, and controversies of a private woman with public consequences. The story of a great-granddaughter of a toy maker who became a serious steward of wild places. Early life and the weight of a name. She arrived into the Kirk Kristiansen family in the mid-1970s in the shadow of a company that had already become a global brand. Her great-grandfather, Ole Kirk Kristiansen, started a small woodworking shop in the Danish countryside that evolved into a company built on one deceptively simple idea: interlocking bricks that let you build anything. That workshop was the seed of an empire. Her grandfather and father carried that empire forward, transforming it into a multinational business, theme parks, and a cultural icon. The result: by the time she was old enough to have opinions about how the world should be, the family name already had weight, not just of money, but of stewardship, tradition, and the expectation that this was a fortune to be managed for the long term. She grew up with access to country estates, horses, and outdoor life, experiences that matter because they're the earliest clues to why someone eventually chooses conservation over corporate office. Her schooling veered from the business track you might expect of an heir. She pursued the study of people and cultures, earning a bachelor's degree in ethnography from Aarhus University. That academic choice, a focus on human relationships, culture, and how people inhabit places, would later shape the way she thought about land, communities, and conservation. Ownership without operation, the family machinery. The family's wealth isn't an accidental pile of shares. Over generations, it was organized. The family consolidated ownership in a holding company, Kirkbi AS, a structure designed to preserve control, continuity, and a long-time horizon. That structural choice explains why the family can keep Lego private, even as it becomes ever more valuable. It also explains how different family members can choose different life paths without dissolving the family's control. One sibling can take the helm in governance, another can pursue public life, and another can retreat into environmental stewardship, all while retaining ownership. A formal generational handover took place in 2023 when Thomas Kirk Kristiansen was appointed chairman of the family's holding entity, marking the transition from third to fourth generation. That move made headlines not because it changed Lego's day-to-day products. Children still build spaceships and castles, but because it clarified who directs the family's capital and how that capital could be used to grow the company, to sell parts of holdings for liquidity, or to bankroll projects far from the factory floor. For our subject, the answer was clear. She chose to use ownership as a resource for environmental projects rather than for corporate management. A private life, largely out of the spotlight. She has long guarded a quiet personal life. She married Christopher Kier Thompson early in adulthood and later separated. The marriage, like much else, remained largely outside public scrutiny. She has children and keeps family life intentionally private. That privacy is part temperament and part strategy. When your decisions can move land markets and shape rural economies, silence looks different from discretion. Silence can be an intentional absence from controversy, but it can also create friction with communities who want transparency. From estates to sanctuaries, a conservation path. What is striking about her path is not simply that she bought land, many wealthy people do, but how she turned ownership into an explicit conservation program. Her projects straddle continents. Denmark, the Scottish Highlands, and parts of Ecuador are all on that map. The approach is practical and programmatic. Buy or secure land, create long-term management plans, coordinate with scientists and local stakeholders, and institutionalize the work through a foundation. That institutional step is crucial. Creating a foundation, Earthkeeper Sanctuaries Foundation, makes protection less tied to a single individual and more anchored to an organization intended to endure. Her land holdings in Scotland, organized through companies and estate structures, are among the most visible and controversial. The centerpiece is a large highland estate that has grown over time. a portfolio that now totals tens of thousands of hectares and puts her among the region's largest private landowners. In practical terms, that land becomes the site for rewilding projects, restoration of peatlands, and connectivity work for species that need large, unbroken habitats to thrive. In philosophy, it signals a belief that private capital can act faster than public institutions to secure and steward habitats that governments may not prioritize. Why buy land? The answers are both ecological and financial. Ecologically, securing hectare-scale parcels can protect core habitat from conversion, maintain carbon-rich peat, and create refuges for species under pressure. Financially, land is a form of durable asset that can be held across generations. For a family used to long horizons, the logic of land as stewardship aligns with a desire for intergenerational responsibility. Projects on the ground, tactics and time frame. Conservation at that scale is detail work. It's not headline-friendly because the critical work happens in surveys, management plans, species profiling, and long-term monitoring. On her estates, priorities have included reintroducing native flora, restoring degraded peatlands to lock up carbon, reducing intensive agriculture where it undermines biodiversity, and creating corridors for wildlife movement. In Ecuador, the emphasis has been on protecting primary rainforest and working with local partners to balance habitat protection with community livelihoods. Programs like alternative income streams, ecotourism planning, and agroforestry training. Crucially, these projects pair science with social engagement. The ethnographic background that informed her education shows up here. Conservation is not only about species and soils, but about the people whose lives are entangled with those places. Local hires, school refurbishments, and community funds are integral to many projects. They're not perfunctory donations, but part of a strategy to reduce conflict and create durable social buy-in. Liquidity moves and public attention. Owning part of a family holding company is not a static thing. In late 2023, she sold a portion of her holdings through family structures, a move reported widely and covered in business press as a major share sale. Those transactions often have mundane practicalities, creating liquidity for private projects, settling estates, or diversifying risk. But to the public, they look dramatic. Headlines that read, "Heirs sells nearly $1 billion in shares," make tidy narratives out of what are often nuanced estate planning decisions. The sale did two things. Practically, it unlocked capital that could be deployed for philanthropy and projects that need cash flow up front. Symbolically, it reminded observers that conservation by private owners is funded by the same market instruments that create celebrity fortunes: share sales, holding company transfers, and carefully timed liquidity events. Controversies: concentrated ownership, optics, and local impact. No long story of private land conservation is complete without controversy. Critics raise several consistent concerns. First is the issue of concentrated land ownership in places like the Scottish Highlands. When tens of thousands of hectares are held by a single private owner, local communities worry about access, local housing prices, and the fate of traditional livelihoods like crofting and smallholder farming. Second is the optics. Billionaire conservationists often travel on private jets and own multiple residences, which can appear hypocritical to those who measure virtue by day-to-day carbon footprints instead of net ecological impact. Third is governance. Private foundations are powerful but lack the democratic accountability of public institutions. Supporters counter that the speed and resources private owners bring can save irreplaceable habitats faster than slow public procurement, and that many private owners do invest in local infrastructure, schools, and employment. In some instances, gifts to local facilities, school refurbishments, funding for community projects, even payroll for estate staff win substantial local goodwill. But goodwill can be fragile when decisions about access, land use, or future development are made behind closed doors. The Scottish case crystallizes these tensions. Local land reform advocates contend that rewilding, if imposed without community dialogue, can hollow out rural economies. Supporters of rewilding argue that restoring ecosystems can create new economic opportunities. Ecotourism, restoration jobs, and the long-term services that healthy ecosystems provide, like clean water and climate resilience. The conflict is not purely ecological or purely economic. It's a clash of temporalities, the slow work of ecosystem recovery versus the immediate needs of communities. A human face to complex choices. There's a human side to the headlines. She didn't wake up as a steward. She inherited landscapes and a family culture that valued both enterprise and caretaking. Many stories about heirs treat money as the primary driver. In this case, her childhood on estates, her love of horses, and her academic focus on people and places all conspired to make conservation plausible as a life project. Her decisions have an internal logic. Buy land to protect habitat, set up a foundation to institutionalize that protection, work with science and locals to manage the land responsibly. The choices reflect a consistent theme: long horizons, intergenerational thinking, and a desire to leave places better than she found them. Governance and the family's balancing act. It's worth pausing on governance. That 2023 handover simplified family roles, one sibling running the governance of the holding company, others free to pursue private projects. That setup allows a family to keep a company private and a fortune stable, while enabling members to follow different callings. But it also means that family decisions, share sales, estate purchases, and philanthropic priorities are negotiated within a private governance framework, not in public markets or with broad shareholder accountability. The family's decisions thus produce public effects, but are shaped by private deliberation. That structural fact explains why many of her moves are sometimes seen as opaque. They are the product of family strategy, not public corporate communications. Measuring success, conservation metrics, and social measures. How should we judge whether this model works? The short answer: by careful metrics. Ecologists measure restoration success by indicators like species richness, habitat connectivity, carbon sequestration rates, and the return of key species. Social scientists look at local employment, housing stability, and educational outcomes. A responsible program will set benchmarks, publish monitoring data, and allow independent audits. Foundations that treat conservation as a long-term project will invest in data collection precisely because ecological change is slow and must be verified over decades, not fiscal quarters. In some cases, early indicators are positive. Peat restoration reduces downstream flooding, reforestation increases bird diversity, and investment in community facilities stabilizes small populations. In others, the change is subtle and takes years. A restored bog might not show full carbon uptake benefits for decades, and the return of wide-ranging mammals requires contiguous habitat that can be hard to reassemble in a landscape with patchy ownership. Scaling up, from estates to systemic change. One of the important questions her life raises is whether private conservation can scale. Buying parcels here and there can create refuges, but systemic challenges, agricultural policy, land reform, national conservation funding require public solutions. Private action can complement public policy, but it cannot replace it. The most hopeful model is a hybrid. Private owners demonstrate what is possible, test restoration methods, and create models that governments can scale. Foundations that publish their data and work transparently make that handoff more likely. The narrative around wealthy conservationists often collapses into two frames: philanthropic heroism or paternalistic enclosure. The more useful angle is to treat such efforts as experiments with potential lessons. If a private foundation shows that certain restoration methods produce measurable carbon sequestration, and if it funds local job training that results in stable rural employment, those lessons can be translated into policy. But that translation requires deliberate partnership, transparency, and a willingness to cede control when scaling is required. A pause on optics, privacy versus accountability. She values privacy, yet the scale of her actions means that public scrutiny is inevitable. The question for any private steward is how much transparency is required to maintain social license. Some families choose radical transparency, publish management plans, open lines of communication with local councils, and fund independent research. Others rely on quiet stewardship, believing the land will speak for itself. The mixed results of both strategies suggest that a middle path, structured transparency focused on ecological and social metrics, is the most defensible approach for long-term legitimacy. Cultural echoes, from toy bricks to living landscapes. There is a poignant symmetry in the family's legacy. The company that made its name producing small plastic bricks is now connected to a family member who thinks in hectare-sized patches of restored peat and rainforest. Both impulses are about building. One constructs playful human-made worlds, the other invests in reconstructing natural ones. The conceptual link is useful as a storytelling device. The same family crafting small building blocks is now, through a different member, thinking about the building blocks of ecosystems, what the future might hold. Looking ahead, we can expect several plausible trajectories. She may continue to expand protected holdings in places where land is still available at scale. She may turn more of her assets into conservation endowments, ensuring perpetual funding, or she may enter more public partnerships to scale lessons learned. Political headwinds, land reform, regulatory changes, community pushback will shape those choices. But the steady through line is likely to be the institutionalization of conservation efforts, moving from a private passion to an organized program. Lessons and open questions for viewers. For audiences watching from the outside, the story asks several important questions. What role should private wealth play in protecting ecosystems? Can concentrated ownership be a force for ecological good without undermining local agency? Do the ends of saving rainforest and peat justify the means when the means are private control? These are hard questions without easy answers, but they are exactly the kinds of questions that a case study like this invites. It asks us to think in decades, not quarters, to weigh ecological integrity against immediate socio-economic needs, and to consider whether stewardship by wealth can ever be fully democratic. A final reflection on complexity. If the headlines tempt a tidy moral, hero or villain, the more honest response is a complex one. She is a product of family legacy and personal conviction. She uses wealth in ways some applaud and others mistrust. Her projects protect habitat and create community investments, and at the same time they raise thorny questions about fairness and control. That ambiguity is the point. Modern conservation is rarely pure, and those who fund it are human and contradictory. End note, the human scale of an intergenerational experiment fluff. At its core, the story is about choices available to someone sitting at the intersection of history and capital. She is inheritor and innovator, landowner and steward. The moves she makes will be read differently in different places. In a Scottish glen, as disruptive or life-saving. In an Ecuadorian rainforest, as protective and generative. In Billund, as another chapter in a family story that always begins with a workshop and a carpenter. The best measure of her legacy will be the quiet one. Whether the plants and animals return, whether children in local schools flourish, and whether the landscapes she touches are healthier a generation hence.